Great. Okay, it's not that many people tonight. Well, there was that, no problem. Okay, so I don't know if some of you were here this morning listening to Dr. Luc Julia's presentation. Really interesting one, really refreshing one about the fact that there is no such thing as artificial intelligence. And I felt like that's kind of a divergent perspective that might be more and more said, actually. We do not hear that much. The fact that AI does not exist. AI does not exist. That's not something that exists. It's something that we've created, actually. So I'm working in the field of artificial intelligence and working mostly on ethics applied to artificial intelligence. So the big question is, how can we apply ethics to something that does not exist? If I agree with Dr. Julia's statement, which I do actually, that's the big question. How can we apply ethics to something that does not exist, that we have created? There is an obvious answer to that, which is whatever you think about artificial intelligence that exists or that does not exist, you have to deal with the fact that lots of people do feel like it exists, right? All around us, and we are all here working on data, discussing about data. We're discussing about AI like if it exists, right? So the point is not to say that it's something tangible, that it's something real. It might be something that is symbolic, but even if it is symbolic, it is here and we have to deal with it, right? We have to take into account. And this is where we're trying to apply ethics to it. So why is ethics so important? You've certainly heard about ethics here and there all the time about artificial intelligence, about the risks. You might have heard about what we call the Terminator syndrome and the risks that are posed by this artificial intelligence system that might be threaten humanities at some point, right? So ethics is everywhere and we're all hearing about ethics. Why is it so important to us to talk about ethics? Basically, for one simple reason, which is linked to the fact that there is a perception that there are adverse consequences that are related to development and the use of artificial intelligence, right? And those adverse circumstances that might arise due to artificial intelligence, they have to be mitigated. So if I go back to the very beginning, let's say AI does not exist, doesn't matter. People do believe that it exists, right? So people act like if artificial intelligence exists. So based on that, they have the perception that there is something out there that might become threatening for humanity. And those people, they need to be reassured. So we know that we cannot use legal tools, right? Because there is no such thing as legal framework that will help us to mitigate the risks associated with artificial intelligence. So they turn their head toward ethics. And they're asking people to act in an ethical way, right? To make sure that AI will not harm people, will not harm humanity, that it will be beneficial for humanity. And based on this perception, people, us, we are creating strong expectations toward all the stakeholders that are involved in the design, development, marketing, and the use of artificial intelligence system. In a study that has been conducted by IBM and Oxford Economics this year on 14,000 people around the world, they've shown and they've actually stressed the fact that you have 85% of all those people, consumers, citizens, employees, that have strong expectation toward organizations in that they will implement or that they will act in favor of ethics of AI, right? So 85%. And that's the reality. Whatever you think about the existence or non-existence of artificial intelligence, that's the reality that we have to deal with, right? And we are, when you have a company and when you're working in the field of artificial intelligence, you have to take that into account, right? This is the market. And you have to please the market. You have to meet the expectations of the market, whatever it is about, perceptions or misperceptions, doesn't matter, right? 85% of the people are actually expecting. It's not only from the outside of the organization, it's also from the inside. And you know that most of the young people that are now leaving schools, they're expecting to find jobs that make sense. So they're expecting organizations to provide them with jobs that will not only help him to make a living, but also to give some sense to what they're doing, right? So those people that are joining organizations today, they're expecting you to behave in an ethical way. Environment is kind of a big focus, a big issue that everyone is concerned about, right? So you might think that the organization you will work with will stick to the rules and the principles that will help to protect the environment, for example. Interestingly, those people that are us, that are expecting organization to be ethical, we are doing so because we fear the risks that are associated with artificial intelligence. And we all have kind of a really wide span of perspective of what those risks are. That might just be something about discrimination, biases, but that might also be something like, threatening humanities. This morning, Luke Julia was mentioning Elon Musk, and he is the guy who was saying, okay, be careful about AI. It might threaten humanities at some point, right? So this is a really, really wide span of concerns that we all have, depending on our culture, depending on our knowledge about artificial intelligence, depending on our, focuses. This is really interesting because when you look at organization, actually, they do not have the same concerns, right? The World Benchmark Organization has conducted a poll on 150 tech companies, specifically about technology. And what they found is really interesting is that only 12 out of them actually conducted impact assessment, right? Only 12 out of 150 tech companies conducted fair impact assessment, meaning that they did not really try to understand or to find what might be the wide spectrum of consequences, bad and good consequences, of the use of artificial intelligence in their activities. 15 out of 150 demonstrated the basic of human rights due diligence. Only 15, right? Only 15. And this is the kind of focus, this is the kind of concern that most of us do have. We expect those organizations, those tech companies to respect or make sure that they will respect their product, will respect human rights, right? And 20 out of 150 commit to public available principles on AI ethics, which is definitely not enough. Basically, what we can see is that while most of the general public is really concerned about the fact that we need AI ethics, actually tech companies are much more enthusiastic about the benefits that can be withdrawn from artificial intelligence than by the risks. Mostly the companies that are working in the field, they are focused on cybersecurity, sometimes on reputational risks, right? But that's basically what they're focusing on. They do not look at any other things, right? So which is a really narrow perspective on the risks and the consequences, adverse consequences of artificial intelligence. So here, what you can see that there is a gap between the perceptions of the general public, us, and the interest of the tech companies. That might also be extended to other companies that are not in the tech industry, obviously, public or private institutions. In the IBM and Oxford economics study, they've also surveyed 1,200 executives from 16 business and technology roles in 22 countries. And what they found is that actually only 20%, not even 20% of all those executives do feel like their actions in the field of AI ethics meet what they are stating, right? So they do agree themselves with the fact that they do not do what it takes to be aligned with their own statement about the importance of those principles, right? You can take that upside down and you will feel like 80% of the executives do feel like they do not meet the requirements that are made by those principles. So obviously some people would say it's normal, right? It's normal because ethics applied to artificial intelligence is highly constraining, right? It puts on your shoulders lots of heavy burden, which is new norms that you have to comply with, apart from the laws, the regulations, right? And so some actors, some stakeholders, some executives would say, I'm not really keen on actually implementing those rules, those principles, right? It takes too much time. It might goes against my interest. I'm not really interested into that. I don't understand it, etc., right? That's true. For some of them, that's true. Some people, some executives, some companies, some organizations are trying to circumvent those rules and those principles. But that's not the majority of them. That's definitely not the majority of them. Myself, with my team at Ethicien du Numérique Digital Ethicist, we are conducting this kind of study, obviously in a humblest way, because we do not have the resources of IBM and Oxford Economics. But we are actually seeing exactly the same things, right? But what we can see is that most of the people we're working with, most of the people we are surveying, they have a strong will to do good. So it's not a lack of will. It's not about, I just want to avoid those constraints. It's mostly about, I don't know about ethics. I don't know enough about ethics. I don't know where to go. I don't know whom to ask. And I don't know how to transform those principles into action, right? So mostly it's not a lack of willing. It's mostly a lack of knowledge, right? And this is where, with my team, we're trying to help those people to understand what ethics is about, right? So obviously, we could just take globally, those people are trying to escape those constraints, which is definitely not the case. Definitely not the case, and we have to be aware of that. That's really, really important. Okay. Okay. Oh, great. So, what happens when you're an executive or when you have to make a decision about the implementation of AI ethics principles in your activities is that basically, first of all, you will ask, okay, what do I have to do exactly? Whom do I have to ask? Mostly you will turn to your compliance officer in your company and ask him or her what to do. People are not always really aware of the complexity of that. So you have basically two options. Really superficial analysis, I would agree, but basically two options. The first one is, okay, ethics is about philosophy. Let's dive into philosophy. Let's learn philosophy. Let's read philosophy. Let's learn about the notions, the concepts. Let's learn about the philosophers and their ideas, right? Let's read the tons of volumes about philosophy that have been written since the 5th century before current era, right? Let's do that. Okay, when you're an executive, you wouldn't do that. You don't have time for that, right? That's totally impossible. Totally impossible. Plus, you will not be able to teach your collaborators about that. So you will not have the resource to do so, right? And for most of the people we're working with that are tech people, they are not intellectually programmed for humanities. Like I'm not intellectually programmed for tech or for mathematics, right? Because those people, they're not really interested in that, and because they've not been raised in philosophy, right? So you cannot oblige those people to learn something they are not able to learn, and they don't want to learn, and they don't have time to learn, and they don't have the resources to learn, right? So you have to put that aside, and this is really frustrating to me as a philosopher because I'd like people to dive into philosophy. But okay, other option, which is the one that we are in now, which is the one that has been chosen by the European Union, by most international institutions today, is what I call cosmetics. Cosmetics basically is the use of the vocabulary of ethics without doing ethics. So we all know that most people that are working in the tech industry, they're not into philosophy, right? They are lay people about philosophy. They don't have the knowledge about philosophy. So if you want to sell them philosophy, you will not sell them those volumes. You will sell them a basic knowledge of philosophy, of ethics. Since most of the codes and documents and regulations that have been issued so far come from the Western world, between 65 and 80% of them, actually they are highly influenced by the philosophical theories that are at stake in the world, in the Western world, and mostly in the European Union. We are really highly influenced, and I'm sorry I'm diving into philosophy, they're highly influenced by Immanuel Kant's deontology, right? You've certainly heard about that, right? I would be a bit critical about that, it's not really Kantian deontology. It's really superficial deontology, right? Most of the people do feel like deontology is mainly about setting principles, right? And providing you with those principles and telling you, okay, now you have to abide by those rules. Okay, that's not deontology. If you read the Metaphysics of Morals by Emmanuel Kant, you will see that it's much more complex than that. What we're doing with the European Union and with most institutions that are working in this field, we are using a top-down approach. I set the principles, I give them to you, and then deal with that. Okay, you just have to abide by those rules, right? In the Kantian deontology, the real Kantian deontology, it's a bottom-up process, right? Coming from each of us, right? So Kantian deontology is really influential in the way we are seeing ethics applied to artificial intelligence. Then cosmetics, what we're trying to do is say, okay, let's establish those principles. What are the principles that all stakeholders working in the field of AI do have to abide by? You've certainly heard about the ethics guideline on trustworthy AI that has been issued in 2019 by the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence of the European Union, a group that has been established by the European Commission. In this document, really interesting, you have 3 components, 4 principles, 7 requirements. And all those elements are basically considered as principles that you have to follow, right? Let's focus on the 4 principles. First principle is respect for human autonomy. Second is prevention of harm. Third is fairness. Fourth is explicability. These are the 4 principles that all people that are working in the field of AI have to implement in order to be ethical and in order to create trust, because the very end, the end goal is to create this kind of trustworthy AI, misleading concept, but anyway, right? Those 4 principles. They are presented clearly in the document as ethical principles, even as ethical imperatives. And ethical imperatives is really important. Why? Because I don't know if some of you are interested in philosophy, because it is a misuse of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, right? So what we're doing with the European Union, with those 4 principles, we are saying those principles are really, really important. You have to follow them. You have to stick by the book, right? You really have to stick by the book and make sure that you are respecting those principles. It is an imperative. It is an imperative, an I imperative. When you're not into philosophy, you will say, oh, okay, that's kind of a really interesting principle. I will try to do that. So you make your list of principles, and then you define metrics. Okay, how can I measure respect for human autonomy? And you define metrics, and then you will measure the metrics, and you will see where you are in terms of respect for human autonomy. And you will do the same with the 3 others, right? And at the very end, you have beautiful Excel sheet, and you have graphs, and you have pictures, and you feel like, okay, I'm here, I'm there, and I have to work on this, work on that. All the companies, with no exception, we are working with at Ethicien du Numérique, digital ethicists, are doing that. And they feel like if you just tick boxes of the principles, of the components, of the requirement, then you are ethical. Okay, good job, right? But what all of the companies I'm working with, and obviously it's kind of a limited sample of companies, if you compare that to all the companies that are working in the field, all those companies, they're missing one point, which is really important and clearly stated in the document of the high-level expert group, which is technically that in some cases, tensions might arise between those principles. This is clearly stated. Tensions might arise between those principles. So it's not sufficient just to tick boxes and to have metrics. What about tension between respect for human autonomy and explicability, for example, that might arise, right? So what the European Union is saying is, in this specific case, what you have to do is to establish, and I quote, methods of accountable deliberation. Methods of accountable deliberation. Those 3 words are really important. Deliberation is really important because this is way where I'm actually jumping into the company, trying to help them. Is deliberation is a complex thing, right? You can just, obviously, you know that most companies, most organizations, they have what we call the ethics committee or ethical committees, right? But it's not because you have those people that are gathering around the table that you will have a deliberation. Doesn't mean that you will have an accountable deliberation, right? Doesn't mean that you will have a method of deliberation. So methods of deliberation, you can find them on the internet, but how to proceed with those deliberation requires some skills, some experience, right? And it's not something that is easy, right? So methods of accountable deliberation, meaning that you will need to gather with some people, skilled people, and you will have to make what they call trade-offs. Okay, you have to make choices about what you will do and what you will not do, right? And those trade-offs, this is once again in the HLAG document, they must be documented. Why? Because if at some point something happens that is bad and you're sued as an executive or a compliance officer or whatever, right? And someone will try to find out what your responsibility is, you will have to prove that you've done whatever it takes to avoid the situation, right? You will have to document and to prove that you've done all that it took to avoid the situation. So if you do not have the methods, or if your deliberation was weak, or if there was no deliberation at all, then your responsibility will be higher because it is clearly stated in the document by the European Commission. You've all heard about the AI Act, I guess, that is about to be issued or not about to be issued. We don't really know. It's only 2014, right? The AI Act is all about that, right? When you have to decide what level of risk is the AI system you're trying to develop or to put on the market, you will have to make this kind of deliberation, right? And you will have to document it. And then you will have to provide the documents to the authorities, right? So if you don't do that, if you just tick boxes, you will face big difficulties. And with the AI Act, that means big fines, right? So you don't want that. So that's not the solution. That's definitely not the solution, right? The solution is here. Ethics is about deliberation, about discussion, about having ethicists. Obviously, I'm selling my own job here, but you need ethicists, me or anyone else, but you need ethicists. We need ethicists, not to do philosophy, but to try to bridge the gap between philosophy and the reality of the organization, right? Because most of the people, they do not want to know about Immanuel Kant's mathematics of morals or Aristotle virtue ethics or principle of responsibility by Hans Jonas. They don't care about that. So you have to put all that knowledge that you've acquired throughout years and try to make it pragmatic, applicable in a specific situation, which is the situation of the company you're working with, right? And that's kind of a challenge. I can tell you that's really kind of a challenge. Anyway, the point is that we don't want to do that. Most people are now kind of interested and curious about ethics, what I'm doing. Most people say, oh, that's really interesting. But we still see kind of a reluctance to jump in, right? To put money on the table and say, okay, come and join us. Come to our ethical committee and try to explain us what we can do, right? What are the methods of deliberation? What are the processes that we can use, right? So there is still this kind of reluctance because I guess that's my analysis, maybe I'm wrong on that, but is that on the priority list of organization, ethics is not at the top at all, not at the top, right? Because mostly when you're talking about ethics, about philosophy, people feel like, okay, oh, no, I don't want that. I don't want that people philosophizing, philosophers that will just come here and, just talk about themselves, about the beauty of Aristotle, Plato, and so on and so forth, right? So there is still this reluctance, but I can see kind of a small move towards something ethics because, once again, there is a strong will to do good for most of the organizations. And I'm totally and deeply convinced of that. Most of the people that are working in the field, they have this really goodwill to do something good. So we're still there. Cosmetics is still the easiest way, right? Just tick boxes, have metrics, measure where you are. But when you do that, what happens is what the World Economic Forum labeled as the intention-action gap, right? Because most of the people, they would definitely endorse all the principles. And you will see that, for example, in their codes of conduct or the codes of ethics of all companies, right? We respect this, we respect that, we are really into this, really into that, human rights are really important, environment is really important, right? It's all about saying, But when it comes to make it operational, that's another issue, right? And then what you see is a really wide gap between what people are stating and what people are doing, okay? This is where we are now, right? So it's easy to state, look, I have the metrics, I have the 4 principles, they are in my ethics code, right? And I can show you with graphs, once again, Excel sheets, etc., that I'm totally compliant. Yes, but you do not really operationalize that. You do not really implement those rules. The problem with that is that it goes totally against the goal of the high-level expert group recommendation, which is to build trust. As consumers, us, as employees, as citizens, when we deal with an organization and we feel like there is this huge gap between what they're selling and what they're doing, what they're saying and what they're doing, we feel like, oh, I'm not really sure that I can trust them, right? So you will turn with people that you know that they will do what they say, right? So you will turn with people or organization where the gap is less wide than it is currently, right? So this is the big issue that we have today. We have this kind of huge gap, and this is something that we can see us in France and working also with international companies, is that, yeah, get beautiful statements, but implementation is really, really weak. One of the problems that people have with those principles, by the way, just back here, those are the 7 requirements by the high-level expert group, right? I've told you about the 3 components, 4 principles. These are the 7 requirements. The problem is that when you take those 7 requirements, there is a big issue which is related to Kantian deontology, which is something that is totally and well documented by people that are working in the philosophy area, which is that Kantian deontology lacks context, right? Actually, with Kantian deontology, you take a principle, you give it to the world, and you ask every single person to abide by this principle. The problem is that for some people, those principles does not make sense, right? For some people, those principles are not applicable in their own situation, right? So you always have to take into account the context. Let's say that you're a company, you're operating worldwide, which is, for example, we're working with a big company working worldwide, and they actually contacted us because they had this issue saying, okay, how can I apply, for example, non-discrimination in countries where discrimination is part of the culture? How can we do that? What can we do with that, right? How can we deal with companies or countries where biases are not a problem, not seen as a problem? How can we deal with countries, cultures, where human rights are not as important as they are in our country and our culture, right? The problem with deontology, which is definitely not something new, right? Once again, Immanuel Kant, it's the Enlightenment, 17th century, right? Since then, lots of people have worked on that, and there is a great job by William D. Ross trying just to reconciliate those principles with context, which is kind of a challenge, but we know that deontology lacks context. While what we know is in our globalized world, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we have to take into account the context. There is no choice. There is totally no choice, right? You have to take context. You have to take into account, this is what we're doing with companies, you have to take into account the existing norms. When I'm talking about norms, you have 3 different kinds of norms. You have the laws, positive laws, or traditional laws. You have the morals, which are the rules that are regulating the community. And then you have the ethics, which is the behavior of those people taking into account the laws and the morals, right? And then you will have to take into account the practices, the traditions, spiritualities, religions, etc., etc. You also have to take into account the values of those people, right? If people do not value human rights, you can do whatever you want, you will not change their mind. If those people that you're working with do not value environment as you value your environment, you will not change their mind. So you have to deal with that. And then you have to deliberate and to make decisions, to make trade-offs, once again. And then you have the culture. That's a really poorly defined concept, culture, but yes, obviously your culture will be really important. There is a really interesting example of that, which is the MIT moral machine study. I don't know if you've heard about that. You can find that on the internet. It's a study on self-driving cars, right? And the question, basically, you can do that by yourself. You can test it. There are different scenarios, and the question is, okay, if a self-driving car has to crash into, let's say, an old lady or two kids, who would you choose, right? What would you put in the algorithm of the self-driving car? Would you think that the self-driving car should crash into the lady or into the kids? If you have to make a choice between a tree and a cat, between a cat and a person, between an elder people and the younger people, and then you have these different scenarios. And what this study shows is that actually you have a really, really strong split between two cultures, the collectivistic culture and the individualistic culture, right? Strong differences. Collectivistic culture, mostly in the Asian world, right? And individualistic culture, mostly in Northern America and Europe, right? And you can see that people would make totally different choices about what to do and what would be acceptable in terms of crashing self-driving cars on a tree, on someone, on an animal, etc., right? So culture are really, really, really important. And also, something that must be taken into account, that people do not take into account, and especially in ethical committee, is the overall environment in which you are operating. If, for example, you are in a country that is surrounded with enemies and foes, your perspective on what is acceptable regarding lethal autonomous weapons, which are weapons that are fitted with artificial intelligence, would be totally different from people like me in France in a secure place, secure environment, right? Because you don't feel like that's so important, right? So you can say, okay, I'm totally against lethal autonomous weapons, right? You can say that. That's easy to me to say that because I'm not threatened by any other countries, not directly, right? But if you're in another country which is threatened, then you would say, okay, I don't care about the consequences. I have to survive. I have to protect myself. My ethical origin is the survival of my country, the protection of my interests, okay? Different perspective, different depending on the environment. Here, back to philosophy, we also have a strong influence of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was an universalist. He thought that there are rules, values, principles that are universals, right? The problem is that so far, there is no study, no proof at all, no empiric study showing that there is even one value that is universally shared. Not at all, right? And I could give you, I would not do that here, but I could give you lots of examples of people that I do not think I share values with them. And just think about it by yourself, you will say, okay, maybe. Values are not universal. But because of this Kantian influence, we do feel like, okay, that's not a big issue. All this is not a big issue because there are values like human rights that are shared, that are common to the whole world, right? And so if you put this principle on the table, everyone will respect it. Not sure of that, right? We all know about human rights and the Declaration of Human Rights and its implementation worldwide. That's definitely not something universal, right? So the context is always, always, always key when it comes to talking about ethics, right? Always put things into context. If you just come, and this is my experience, I was in the military before. I've served for 27 years in the French Air Force. I was working with the NATO on lethal autonomous weapons. That was really interesting because we were coming to the table, and what we were doing as French guys and also as Europeans, we were telling the world the truth, because we hold truth, right? Because we are the heirs of the Enlightenment, because we have a past background of philosophy, so we know what is great, what is good, what is bad. We know what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. So we went to the world and spread the word, Urbi and Orbi, and said, okay, let's do that, right? Diplomacy being what it is, all people around the table were nodding, saying, okay. But back home, as I was saying just before, you will just put things into context and say, okay, that was BS, right? Because now I have to defend myself against this or that people, this or that country, this or that communities, right? And then all those principles, I've noted, I've said yes because that's diplomacy, I have no choice, but I don't care about them, right? And it's exactly the same with artificial intelligence. And with those rules, you can put all those beautiful rules. The UNESCO has established the recommendations. That's not a difficult bet, easy guess, I would say. No one will respect them, okay? Because AI is a high-stake spectrum of technologies, okay? High-stake. And the stakes and the benefits of AI will always come first, always, right? So those beautiful principles, those beautiful words that are coming from the Western world, when you have to apply them to Asia, to Africa, to Southern America, doesn't work. And even within the European Union, we do not agree on values. So just think about that, right? So this is beautiful. This is all beautiful, but that does not work, unfortunately. Okay. So what should be done here, and how can we make the most of ethics? That might work for companies, that might work for other organizations, that might work for us. I would say that, and this is something that is disputable, obviously, I would say that the most important thing is to create a culture of ethics. If you come to people, and if I come to you and tell you, okay, look, these are the principles that you have to respect in this room, right? You will abide by those rules, but you will have maybe some reluctance, right? And in some cases, because that will go against your interest, you will try to circumvent those principles, right? It's like speed radars or speed cameras on the road, right? You put speed cameras, people will slow down. But as soon as you remove them, people will go fast, right? Because they don't have the culture. So actually, you always have to be in a sanctioned process, right? Always to be here and to sanction people that are divergent, right? If you create the culture of ethics, then you will have something that is normal within the group. That takes time. That takes time. You cannot do that in the blink of an eye, not 1 month, 2 months. That takes time, definitely, right? But at some point, and this is my experience from the military, everyone will be at the same page, right? And we have to discuss. We all think about the same values, the same ideas, the same objectives. We know where we're going. And if you do not agree with the values, we know you do not agree with the objective, then you're free to leave, okay? You're free to leave. But if you create this culture, people will have exactly the same level of understanding. They will have the same objectives, the same values, etc. So that will speed up the process of decision making when it comes to making trade-offs. To do so, the first thing that you have to create is are ethics spaces, 2 kinds of ethics spaces within the organization, with your collaborators, right? Because you really need to know what your people think from the inside. And I'm not talking only about tech people that are working directly on programs, etc., or algorithm, but also people that are in, administrative support. Because those people, they have a say in what you are doing with your company. And think about that, in some cases, people that do not agree with what you're doing might go public and put it on the web, put it on the social networks, and that might have huge consequences on your reputation. So ethics spaces are really important. So you need processes, you need some kind of methods to make those people comfortable speaking out what they think. You have to be also open-minded to different perspectives. That's really important. And you also need ethics spaces that are outside of the companies, right? Just to involve all the stakeholders that are working with you. Your investors, your service providers, all the people that you're interacting with, because at some point they will have to make sure that they're working with someone they can trust, right? So here too, you need to create this kind of, a basic common level of understanding of what is at stake with your activities. Okay, that's really important. So those 2 ethics spaces are really important. And the other component that is really important is training, education. So once again, it's not about reading all the volumes about philosophy. It's not about reading Immanuel Kant in German in the text. It's about just giving the basic, but the serious, the solid knowledge, right? Not the one that is sold by the European Union, not the one about just learning by heart all those principles. It's all about how can I deliberate? How can I make decisions? Starting with myself as an employee in the company. If I do not agree with what my company is doing, what are my options, right? How can I make trade-offs? Because we're all doing trade-offs, right? I've been in the military, I can tell you that I've made trade-offs, right? Sometimes you do not agree with a decision that has been made by the military or political authority, and then you have to think by yourself, okay, where am I in that? Do I leave? What does that cost me if I leave? Do I stay? What does that cost me to stay, right? And then you make a choice. This can be done only through education, right? Education at all levels of the society, of the organization. This culture of ethics, ethics spaces, and education will be beneficial not only to the organization, but to the whole society, because you will involve lots of people in that, right? And if you multiply that by all the companies all around the world, then you will have lots of interaction, right? And also what would be really interesting is that if you're operating worldwide, and you have this outside ethics space, external ethics space, then you will maybe bring different culture to the table. And maybe you will understand why people are doing what they're doing instead of just judging them from your own lens, from your own perspective, Western perspective, right? And just throwing them to the bin saying, okay, you must not do that, you bad guys, because you're bad guys, right? I've had the discussion tons of time. Let's be clear about that, about China and Russia or Saudi Arabia, right? People have lots of a prioris. They don't even know why they have a prioris. They are biased in the way that they think, but the reverse is true, right? But maybe if you discuss with those people that are working in those countries that you're rejecting a priori, maybe you will understand things, right? And maybe you will be able to make a step toward them, and maybe you will be able to meet in the middle of the bridge instead of just rejecting them. So this is the way it works. And the very idea here is just to obviously make this gap narrower, right? You're just trying to make sure that your intentions are aligned with your actions, right? Not only for legal purposes, which is once again related to the AI Act and the requirement by the European Union or international institution, but also because it is a matter of building trust. And here, if I may, I don't know how many time I have left, but I would just tell you something that is really important. When we're talking about trust in the field of artificial intelligence and in the field of ethics applied to artificial intelligence, we are basically talking about trustworthy AI, which means that we have to trust artificial intelligence, which means that we have to trust the object, the technology, right? And what this shows is actually that trustworthy AI is a totally misleading phrase. What we trust, it's not the technology, it's the people behind the technology, right? We trust or we do not trust people that are designing, developing, marketing, using those technologies, not the technology itself, right? Exactly the same with planes, right? When you jump into a plane, you don't feel like, okay, I trust the plane. Doesn't make sense. When I sit on the chair, I don't think, okay, I'm trusting the chair. I might not trust the people who built the plane. I might not trust the people who built the chair. And then I have some reluctance to use them, right? But it's not about the technology, it's not about the tool, it's about the people. And this is what is shown here with this intention-action gap. And this is something that most of the organizations I'm working with are not aware of, because once again, in this recommendation of the high-level expert group and all other documents that have been published on and released by the European Union, the focus is on trust towards artificial intelligence, which is kind of paradoxical because at the same time, we say that we need human control over AI, which means that AI is not autonomous. So if AI is not autonomous, it is not capable of intentions. And if it's not capable of intention, there is no need to trust it or not. You only trust people because you feel that their intentions are good toward you, or you do not trust them because you feel that their intentions are bad, right? So if there is no intention, because the technology is not autonomous, then there is no discussion about trustworthiness. You can talk about reliability, for example. You can say, okay, this chair is reliable, or this plane is reliable, but it's not about trust. So trust is about the people. And it is up to us in companies, in organizations, also as citizens, to make sure that we are building this contract of trust. Okay, saying, okay, when I'm saying that I do feel like transparency is really important, I do act accordingly, right? This is really important here. And once again, you really have to put that into context. I would say, just as a former military guy, I would say transparency when it comes to AI applied to healthcare. Okay, transparency when it comes to AI applied to defense industry, certainly not. You don't want to be transparent about what you're doing, right? And if you look at the AI Act, you will see that all the defense and security industry is totally outside of it, right? It's not concerned by that, because we know that it's a specific, very specific context where those principles will not apply. Okay, I'm done. Thank you for your attention. And that's it.
We have a few questions.
Sure.
Microphone, please.
So the graph, around 55% of the companies are endorsing,
Yeah.
and around 20% are like, implementing. Why this? We are not bothered about the other part who are not even endorsing. Like, okay, can we think of even getting some people who are endorsing, like some companies who are endorsing, and that by the law of proportion, even that operationalizing will also increase?
Yes, right. The gap might be the same, but obviously you might have higher rate of endorsement and higher rate of action, mostly because lots of companies, depending on the size and what they are, they're not truly aware of that, right? This is a worldwide survey where, for example, those rules, principles that have been established by the European Union are not really correctly known, right? And also because, as I was saying, you have some companies that are not really keen on endorsing those rules. Because the other way to reduce the gap between those two things is to lower your intention. If you lower your pretension, or if you do not say, okay, I'm endorsing this kind of principle, then I will not have any kind of gap. I'm totally coherent with what I'm doing. I'm not saying I like transparency and I'm not doing anything about transparency. I'm coherent with myself, right? So you have different strategies that can be used, but mostly because those companies, they are not aware of that, or because they are not in the Western, circles, etc.